Good afternoon. I hope you can all hear me and see me, and not any of the other senses. We'll skip those. So my name's Tom Hukins. I'm going to talk about this. Basically, I am a Perl consultant in London, and I work with various companies. So I've used HTML FormHandler at small companies, large companies, different sizes of team. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. Now, HTML forms, here we are at a conference in 2016. And in 1996, HTML forms weren't really all that exciting anymore. They weren't even new then, but we're in 2016. And so here I am, like really cool, really cutting edge, telling you all about something that wasn't cool 20 years ago. And here you are showing up for my talk. So thank you for that. So I suspect most of you know that HTML forms are a bit like this. We have the form, we have some fields on it. Okay, that's all fine. And the form, when it's rendered, looks a bit like this. And if we want to make the form look better, we use cascading style sheets, CSS, and the form looks a bit tidier. So that's great. Now, where does HTML FormHandler come into all this? Well, this is one of those CPAN modules where you can just look at the name and it's like pretty clear what it does. I'm not going to tell you what it does. But what are the aspects of handling forms? I think the way I think of HTML FormHandler is that it does three things for me. It lets me define how my forms are going to work. It lets me validate the user's input for the form. And then it lets me generate the HTML, rendering the form out to the web browser. And it's more complicated than this, but at its simplest, there are three parts to HTML FormHandler, three objects. Basically, there's the form object itself. The form contains fields. And then to make sure that we render the form, we use widgets. So it's more complicated than that, but I think that's a good starting point for it. So yeah, here's an example of a form. Here's the field. And then the widget generates HTML that looks a bit like this. So we've got these, as I've said, these kind of two separate ways of looking at what it is and what it does. And these all belong together. We define the form, but within the form we also define fields. And we validate a form, but in order to validate a form, we validate all the fields within that form. So I think all these four ideas all belong together. And the rendering and the widgets are kind of separate. We use widgets, also themes, to render out the forms. So I'm going to walk through these different things that FormHandler can do for you, starting with form definition. Now, FormHandler is very much Moose-based. If you've ever used Moose and you like Moose, FormHandler will feel kind of like an extension of that. Also, if you really dislike Moose and it doesn't work for you, you're probably going to really dislike FormHandler because it's Moosey. And this is kind of standard Perl class. You tell it what the name of the class is. Normally you'd say use Moose, but here you say use HTML FormHandler Moose, which is an extension of Moose. And then in Moose, when we're declaring our attributes on the class, we say has. And for FormHandler, we can say has, we can define Moose attributes on our class. But we say has field to define the form fields. In this case, we've got a field which is name. So let's say it's a person's name. And the type of that is text. And you can see underneath the person has an email address. So that's all fairly like a nice clear definition of basically what we're expecting to show on the form. And if you want to use that class that I've just shown in your code, you instantiate the object at the top, and then you pass the data that the user has input into process. So you're processing the form with the parameters that the user submitted. Now, let's imagine that you want to generate forms dynamically. The way I showed before was you're creating a package, you're writing Perl code. It might be that you want to generate forms based on some data from a database, on some user configuration or whatever, but you want to generate these things dynamically. You can pass in a field list to the constructor, FormHandler's constructor, so I don't need to write that myForm class. I can just build it up on the fly like this. Some fields you want to display on the form but you don't want to be submitted alongside the form. For example, often you'll see a submit button on a form, which is great because the users want to submit the form, the button helps them do that, but you don't want the submit button to be one of your parameters. So if we override the form's name attribute, then this is kind of a special kind of field that's rendered on the form, but doesn't get submitted from within the web browser. Also, the text fields I showed, name and email, are basically the user enters some text, but FormHandler supports pretty much everything that HTML forms support. So, for example, you might want to give someone a list of options and let them choose from those options. You might want, so in that case, the type of field you have is select. And you can set default values. If when you're rendering the form you want to give the users a default choice, fine, you can do that. And then we can specify the options like this. So basically what we saw earlier, or what we're seeing here is we're seeing has field color and options underscore color. And basically anything that's called options underscore as a method will relate to the corresponding field here. And yes, some of you might think I've spelt color wrong here, which is fine. I'm not going to argue about that today. Okay, so we've defined our forms. The next step is once the user has entered input, we've seen the call to process to deal with that input. What we then want to check is, well, was what the user entered acceptable? So let's come back to this again. We've got a name field on a form which is text. Let's imagine that our application needs to know people's names. We can't deal with people if we don't know their name. This required attribute lets us do that. So basically, if I don't enter a name, then the validation fails. And we see this a lot on web forms, and I think one of our duties as developers is having conversations with people about what fields are required and what they aren't. You know, we're all developers, I guess, but as well as being developers, we use the web. And how many times have you seen a field on a form where it says, your cat's name is mandatory, and you're sat there going, I don't own a cat. How can I enter my cat's name? So you just make up a name for your cat that isn't true. And that aggravates the users because the users have to enter a load of rubbish, and it messes up your data. So yeah, you can make fields on your form mandatory, but I think that there are broader, make sure you're having conversations and thinking about whether things are mandatory. We can also use data types to specify what our field should be. Again, coming back to the moose thing, if you've used moosex types to define your own data validation rules, that's exactly what FormHandler does. There's moosex types common, which is a set of moose types that people commonly use. And HTML FormHandler types is very similar to that, but built into FormHandler. So basically, you can reuse these common validation patterns that people have already come up with, as well as inventing your own. And it's all, if you've ever written any moose types, it's just the same. So you don't need to learn something new. In this case, we're saying apply no spaces. So basically, we're saying a user's name must not contain spaces. And again, this is one of those things where you probably want to have that conversation with someone, but it's an illustration. So that's how we specify the rules for validation. In the application code, the form object has this validated method on it, and we just call that. It returns true or false. Great. Again, because this is OO, the form object has a field accessor, and we can retrieve the fields from the form like that. And each field object has a value method, so we can get the value that the user input, basically the value that we saw in the process call earlier, from the form. So this is how we can get at our data. And yeah, people do make errors when they submit forms, and the validation fails. And this errors method returns an array of all the validation failures, all the errors that happened. Okay. Now, let's imagine a slightly different example. Let's imagine a login form where you've got a username and password. And everything we're seeing here should be kind of familiar. It's all just doing stuff we've already seen. Okay, no big deal. So one thing we can do as well as validating fields is provide our own custom validation methods for the whole form. So this would be on my form class. I would write subvalidate. And again, this will look fairly similar. We're calling the field accessor, getting the values out. here's my highly secure code. I bet you can't guess what the password for this application is. My highly secure code, if it fails, we add an error on the form. Okay, so that's how we deal with validation failures. Except we can't actually add an error on the form. The errors have to be on a given field. Okay, well that's fine. So basically, if the user enters an incorrect username and password, we set an error on, well, what? Is the username wrong? Is the password wrong? Well, neither. It's the combination of a username and passwords wrong. And what FormHandler gives us to deal with that is compound fields. So we say we've got a login field which is compound, and then we use that login.u and login.p to specify subfields of the compound login field. And what that is, so it's basically kind of a hierarchical thing. And we can then write, just as we saw the validate method on the form, we can say validate underscore login. And much like the options underscore methods, the name of the field follows the underscore, so validate login. And this time, we not only get the form object in $self, but we get the field object, in this case, the compound field login. And that compound field has subfields, so we can get out the username and password value. And this time we can call add error because we're working with a field, but that error isn't on the username or the password, it's on the compound thing overall. So that's kind of a cleaner way of dealing with the interactions between different fields. You might see this with, say, calendars as well. You might have a day, month, and year, and that would be a common example of a compound field. So we've looked at defining forms and validating them, and so far we've not actually shown anything. Of course, if you've got a form and no one can see it, you know, is that like the tree in the forest that makes a sound, or what? Who knows? Okay, so here's how we render a form. Again, it's really easy. What this does is it generates all the HTML for the form, so calling code roughly like this, or if you're using a templating system, something like this, generates HTML that looks roughly like this. I've edited this a bit. I took out a few attributes, which I'll come to later, because it wouldn't have fitted in the margin or whatever the usual excuse for that sort of thing is. So what we see here is that we were talking about validation earlier, and the built-in rendering in FormHandler is setting these error classes for us. And coming back to the CSS earlier, the neat thing about FormHandler's rendering is it gives you the structure of the HTML. But how the form looks is up to you. You define that in CSS. So you can go and set your CSS rules for this error class within the form and render that out however you want. And then we see the error message here. Again, that's got its own CSS class on, which is handy. Now, I showed you that render method that's built in, but sometimes you might not want to use FormHandler's default rendering, and it's really flexible. You can also iterate through the fields in the order that they're specified. So here, basically, whatever the specification for the form is, we're going through each one, and then we can do whatever we want for that particular field. And of course, we can do this in our templating system as well. So sometimes you might find that you're writing the back-end code and the front-end code, in which case you get to choose what approach you take. Sometimes you'll be working with front-end developers who don't go anywhere near the Perl code, and then you can figure out what's going to work best for both sides. So you can either go with the whole built-in template tool, just let form handling take hold of the rendering. You can customize it yourself, or you can go anywhere in between. There's all sorts, it's really flexible if you want to kind of do some bits yourself, but not all of it, or you want to do all of it yourself or none of it. The rendering control is totally up to you. You've got control over as much as you want. And as I showed earlier, you can access the individual fields for rendering, just as we did for validation. And we can access all the errors from each field as well. So we've got a lot of kind of control at getting in the innards of the validation if we want to do our own bespoke, customized rendering. But let's say we do want to use the built-in rendering, but we want to do it slightly differently. Earlier we saw that each of the form elements was rendered within a div. And if we have this somewhat gangster-sounding wrapper tag, which in this case creates a bulleted list, I guess bullets are gangster, are they? I don't know. Then we can do that. But we can also define all sorts of other attributes and CSS classes on the elements. So from within the Perl code, we can take control of the HTML. And bear in mind, as I said earlier, you don't have to write these as classes. This can be data that you pass into the constructor, so you've got a lot of flexibility on how you define the rules. You can also define widgets, and these are basically reusable approaches to rendering. So you might want to, earlier when we saw the individual field within the form, you can create a widget which defines how to render given fields, and you can reuse that widget throughout your application. And there are several widgets built into HTML form handler as well. So let's come back to our list of options that we saw earlier. By default, when we render this form, we see something like this. It's an HTML select list. But let's imagine we didn't want to render it that way. We can use one of form handler's built-in widgets, radio group, to output radio buttons instead. So we've got, again, it's the flexibility, one line of configuration. Okay, so that's just a brief introduction to kind of some of the core things that you can do with form handler. And coming back to the three things that you have to do those, there are several things that you'll want to remember. If you're using form handler, there are a few traps it's easy to fall into. If you're used to using Moose, you'll know that you don't need to say use strict, use warnings in your code, because Moose does that for you. It's friendly and helpful if you like strict and warnings. HTML form handler, you say use HTML form handler Moose, but that doesn't put strict and warnings on in your application. And if you're like me, one day you'll be sat there writing code, and you'll write some really broken code, and you'll think, hey, why is strict not complaining? And then you discover that doesn't happen, so you go and put use strict and use warnings in your code. The next thing I did after this was I found a module test strict, and I put that in my test suite, so that every time I forget to put use strict and use warnings in my code, my test suite shouts at me, which I never do because I'm perfect. Okay, make immutable. If you've used Moose, you'll know that making your class immutable speeds up your code. Basically, what that does is, until you call make immutable on your class, you can always make changes to it. You can always say has and add more attributes. You can always, in form handler, you can always say has field and add more fields. And what make immutable does is it basically kind of freezes your class. It says, okay, we've done defining this. We've finished with that. Let's freeze where everything is. And consequently, the code can run faster. And if you've done this in Moose, you'll say, oh yeah, cool, my code's faster. If you write HTML form handler forms without make immutable, sometimes your code runs really slow. I sort of sat there waiting 2 seconds for a form to render a few months ago, and then I realized why it was running so slowly. So if anyone says to you, yeah, I looked at HTML form handler, but it was really slow, it might be that they were doing something else, but it might be that you want to make your class immutable. By default, form handler outputs kind of XHTML, HTML4 era type stuff. But nowadays we have the HTML living standard, which at one point in time was HTML5. If you're writing HTML using either the living standard or HTML5, make sure you set this attribute. The type that we looked at earlier, the email type, if you don't have this, will just render as a plain text field. So, of course, if you are using HTML4 or XHTML in your application, don't set that, because then it will render stuff that you don't want. But if you are using recent versions of HTML, make sure you use that. By default, form handler sets ID attributes on all your elements. In this case, coming back to the person's name, it's given as an ID of name. That's fine if nothing else on your page has an ID of name. But for common strings like name or other things, you might get clashes, especially if, again, if the front-end developers are different from the back-end developers. People might already have a whole load of IDs on the page for other things, and you're going to find really weird bugs when you say, well, get me the field with the ID name, and it turns out there's several of them. So that's not much fun for debugging things. So what we can set is an ID attribute on each field definition to something that's a bit more unusual, so that the HTML renders out like this. Again, I know that all of us write perfect code and never make mistakes and never need to do debugging, but if one of your colleagues does that. You can pass this verbose attribute into my form. And what that means is every time you call any method on FormHandler, it'll output a little bit of diagnostic information. So not much fun in production, but great during development and maybe testing sometimes. Now, cross-site request forgery is something, if you're creating any sort of website that people use or know about, like any of them, CSRF attacks are something that people can do to trick browsers into submitting forms without the user knowing, so you can do nasty stuff. So you probably want to, if you don't know what this is, go read up on it. It's kind of a bit long for this talk. But there isn't anything in HTML form handler that deals with this just kind of conveniently and magically. There is a plaque middleware that you might want to use, or you might want to kind of knock up your own form that associates, sorry, you might want to knock up your own code that associates tokens with each form, so you can check that this form isn't being submitted by a good person who's been tricked by a bad person, because the web is a scary place. So those are some things to remember when you're working with FormHandler. Now, the title of this talk was HTML FormHandler, Web Forms, and More. And I haven't done any more yet. It's all just been web forms. So here's where the more comes in. Lots of us use dbix class for defining objects. And I'm sure you can imagine, let's say we've got that person record with name, email address, and a whole load of other information. If you've got a database which has all the details of people in, you might say, well, fetch me a person called Tom and show his details on a form. You can fetch that person from the database and use HTML form handler's built-in trait form model dbix to do all that for you, which is great. However, once your forms start depending on your database, unit testing your forms means that your tests for your form code need to go and talk to the database, and sometimes that's okay, but sometimes it's annoying. So I've mentioned a bit that FormHandler is based on Moose, and just like Moose, you can break things down into roles and lots of reusable code. So if you do decide to integrate your form class with dbix class, one way of dealing with this is to also have very similar classes that don't use the dbix stuff that you can use for testing that are almost identical to the dbix ones, or whatever. Maybe you have a different approach. But this is something to consider, but it's kind of your call on how you work with it. Maybe you don't want to output HTML. I talked earlier about how kind of definition, validation, and forms and fields belong together. What you could do is create your own widgets, or what's called a theme. Or you could just write the Perl code to iterate through forms and fields and do something else. One thing I found myself doing recently was I was writing a search system. And it had the standard results pages, you know, page 1, page 2, page 3, da-da-da-da-da. And then I was writing some other code that didn't have any web forms on it, but I wanted people to page through it. And if someone said, I want to go to page dog, well, that's not a number, so it wanted to fail validation. If someone said, I want 5 million results per page, my application wants to say, you can't have 5 million results per page, that's too many. And I'd already written this code for the search form. So what I did was I took the form handler logic and just reused these 4 parts of the code in something that wasn't a web form. So it's really flexible. Multiple language support, because yeah, we all end up, I'm one of those horrid English people who thinks that all the world speaks his own language. But built-in FormHandler supports these. And it's an open source project, so you can go and add your language to the code base. Yeah, question? Okay, so yeah, that's a good question. The point here is that, yeah, I've mentioned that FormHandler has multiple language support, and this is essentially for the validation, the errors, that sort of stuff. And your question is, how do we do that for the labels? Because what we've seen for the labels so far is that they're hard-coded strings. Again, being one of those lazy English people, I haven't dealt with this a great deal, but I mean, we looked at the example of building up a form not from a class, but from data. And I guess you could take that approach, so you could build it up from data.
I was wondering
Not that I'm, so yeah, the idea here is that you might pass in a localization object. I'm not aware of that. It's an again, yeah, most of the stuff I do is for my customers in London, and a lot of their customers are English, and sorry. But yeah, I mean, there's documentation. So it may be that this, I don't know, maybe the documentation answers this. FormHandler is, as you've probably seen from the talk, one of these really, really powerful, flexible CPAN modules. And what that means is when you start, you think, great, I want to start using this new module. You go look at the documentation, and 3 hours later, you're sort of like, whoa, where am I? So there's a lot of documentation, but it's mostly well documented. One thing I find myself doing a lot is reading through the module's test cases. There's lots of good examples in the test suite for how to actually go and use it. And also I've fixed a few bugs in it, and I realized this morning that I've introduced a new bug to it as well, but I'm not going to tell you what that is because I'm going to fix it. There's really good support for this module. The IRC channel is very quiet. People on it are really quite knowledgeable and friendly. And yeah, I mean, we sort of bounce ideas around on there. All the code's open source. The GitHub repository has bug reports, pull requests. So yeah, it's kind of classic open source stuff. And I realized that there's so much more in FormHandler that I haven't covered, but that's my introduction. Before we finish, does anyone have any other questions? I know I tend to talk quite quickly. I'm impressed that someone managed to interrupt me, so thanks for that. Yeah. Okay, yeah, the question is, if you're using FormHandler with any web framework, how does it hook in? I've used FormHandler with Dancer, Catalyst, and Mojolicious, and the answer for all three of those is really nicely. Basically, they all give you a request parameters method. So you can basically get either the query string parameters for get request or the body content parameters for post request. And all three of those frameworks have a give me the parameters as a hash ref. And the format that that hash ref is returned in is exactly the same format that the process method takes as its parameters. So basically, yeah, you say to your web framework, give me the parameters, and then you just hand them straight over to the process method. And there may be web frameworks out there that aren't so convenient, but the three I've used with it are just fine. Anyone else? Yeah. Good question. What if I want some validation in the front end, for example, using JavaScript? Well, the really bad answer is you can just go and duplicate all your logic on the front end code. That's not the answer you wanted. Okay, what we've seen already is that we've got the definition that we have for our form objects is easy to get at. We've got a form object, we can call fields on that. And then we've got our types. You could extend the type system to output attributes on the HTML, for example, classes. You know, I was talking earlier about the idea of using HTML classes for CSS, but the other thing you can do is have your JavaScript front-end code go and look for elements with a certain class on. And then, so let's say, for example, I set the class color. You know, I had that red, green, blue. What I can... Actually, that's a bad one because radio buttons, it's pretty hard. But let's say it's your name. You want to validate the user's name and it needs to be longer than 3 characters. You could set a class longer than 3 and then use your JavaScript front-end code to do that. I mean, what you could do is create something that was reusable. I don't think anyone's done that yet. The neat thing that has been done, though, is that FormHandler integrates with Bootstrap. So if you want to, that's more for rendering than validation. But if you were to look at the Bootstrap theme, you might be able to come up with something. I'm at the risk of babbling on a bit too much, but yeah, that's an interesting idea. Do we have any more? Maybe we've got time for a quick question, a very quick one. Is it possible to define a field of multiple values? Yeah. So, you know, I showed the example of type equals select. There's an argument you can pass to a type equals select, which is something like select multiple. I forget off the top of my head, but it's just the case of passing another argument, and then, yeah, you can do multiple values. I'm going to be around for the whole of the rest of the conference, as I guess most of you are, so if anyone wants to chat about FormHandler or other stuff, or how us horrible English people are nasty and imperialistic, please come and find me anytime the rest of the conference. Thank you for listening.